Moving on to the stomach, which is kind of a misconception. A lot of people think stomach, a lot of digestion takes place there. That's not true. Your stomach is more of a storage and mixing area. So the stomach itself is kind of a J-shaped organ, upper left abdominal quadrant, so upper left side. It's not really right in the middle, and your stomach is not down here, and your stomach does not get bigger when you get pregnant. Your uterus gets bigger, and your muscles in the front will expand, but your stomach is up in this area. It's not down in what you guys call the belly region. So the function of the stomach, it receives food from the esophagus. It mixes food with digestive juices, so gastric juices. If you've ever been sick, had the flu, and you throw up, that kind of burning feel comes from the gastric juices that are in your stomach. Rugae are these folds of the mucosa level, our layer and submucosal layer, and those rugae is what allows your stomach to expand. So when you eat a large meal, your stomach's going to expand, and like on holidays, if you eat a very large meal, your stomach expands, and then it has those sensory organs, so when it starts to shrink, you get hungry. And a lot of times you'll notice after you eat large amounts of food, you feel very hungry the next day when you think, gee, I ate a lot, I shouldn't be so hungry. Well, when you expand your stomach expects to be fed more. Actually, people who are obese and eat a lot, their stomach actually expands, and their stomach will be a lot larger than an average sized person. And they'll be hungry because their stomach is used to being filled to a certain amount, and then when it's not at that level, it tells itself that it's hungry. The stomach is divided into the cardia, meaning closest to the heart, the fundus, the body, the pylorus, and the pyloric canal, and we'll have a diagram that I'll point those out at. So esophageal sphincter is at the bottom of the esophagus. The pyloric sphincter is at the bottom of the stomach, and that's going to release food from the stomach into the small intestine. So there's a sphincter muscle at the bottom of the esophagus and the bottom of the stomach. So I like this diagram. You should know the parts on this diagram. Here's the esophagus, so here's the bottom of the tube coming down. Here is where that esophageal sphincter muscle will be that can close so that food doesn't come back. When I look at the entire stomach, here's those folds, those rugae that allow your stomach to expand. The cardia is this area of the stomach that's at the top, close to your heart area. Fundus is kind of this top part that comes up here. And then the body of the stomach is the largest portion right here. Then as I get down to the bottom, we're going to have the pylorus, or the pyloric part. Here's kind of where it begins, and then the pyloric canal is basically the end of the stomach. And then the pyloric sphincter is at the end of the stomach, and that's what's going to prevent food from the small intestine from coming back into the stomach. So those parts you should know for your stomach. Secretions, so gastric juices and things like that have to come from somewhere, and there are gastric glands that are in the mucosa, mucus, that's going to be more of a thick juice that's allowed out. Gastric pits are also where they come from. Gastric glands generally contain 3 types. Mucus cells produce mucus. That should be easy to remember. The function of mucus is to protect the stomach lining. That gastric juice is very acidic. If your stomach is not protected by mucus, that acid could eat a hole right through your stomach. People who, like someone who's bulimic and makes themselves throw up, whenever you throw up, some of that gastric juice does come up through your esophagus and your mouth. And that is why people who are bulimic, a lot of times their teeth will go bad, because that acid in the stomach comes up and then it gets on their teeth and wears away their teeth. So mucus is very important for protection of the stomach. Then there are chief cells. Chief cells secrete pepsin, and pepsin is what is used to digest protein. It's the enzyme that breaks down protein. Inactive, when it's not digesting, it's pepsinogen, which is activated when it comes into contact with hydrochloric acid. So the acid that's in your stomach is hydrochloric acid. Pepsinogen is the inactive part. When it comes into contact with hydrochloric acid, it's going to secrete pepsin, and pepsin is going to help break down proteins. Amylase was in your saliva. That breaks down carbohydrates. So we have mucus cells, we have chief cells, and then we have parietal cells, and those are the cells that actually secrete the hydrochloric acid. Other things that are found in gastric juice is the intrinsic factor. That's very important for helping your body absorb B12. Without the intrinsic factor, your body cannot absorb and digest that vitamin. All of these together is called gastric juice. So the mucus, the pepsin, the hydrochloric acid, all of those things together form your gastric juices. So if I look at these, cadaver site, you can see pictures like this. A diagram, sometimes easier to look at first. So a gastric pit is basically just a pit. It's an opening that goes down into the mucus layer, also down, almost down into the submucosa, but not quite. So it sticks here towards the top. Here, the blue, all of the blue on here are your mucus cells, so they secrete mucus. These darker, they're kind of a darker brown, those are the parietal cells, and those are going to secrete your hydrochloric acid. Most of your chief cells are located down at the bottom of the gastric pit. So they're all found in different layers. If I look over here at an actual microscope slide, it's a little bit harder to tell. The mucus cells are going to be up at the top, parietal cells are going to be in the middle area, and then these chief cells are going to be at the top, or at the bottom, sorry. A diagram is much easier to look at and decipher than a microscopic slide. Good table to look at to review what the different functions are. And then regulation. So your gastric juices need to be regulated depending on what you're eating, how much you're eating. So parasympathetic impulses from acetylcholine and the hormone gastrin, and both of these are released from your gastric glands. When more food enters the small intestine, so small intestine is after the stomach. When food leaves the stomach, enters the small intestine, secretion from the gastric juice is inhibited by sympathetic. So parasympathetic increases gastric juices, sympathetic decreases or inhibits gastric juices. Presence of fats, proteins in the upper part of the small intestine are going to release cholecytokinin from the intestinal wall, and that also decreases gastric production. So when my food starts to enter the small intestine, that's a huge key to my stomach that I do not need to produce as much. And you can look at this diagram, shows, this one probably not as important as the last one, But gastrin, more gastric juice. Parasympathetic release of gastric juice. It's going to increase it. The stomach itself, this is the part that is a misconception, so maybe highlight this one. Your stomach does not absorb hardly anything. Very little. Small quantities of water, certain salts, alcohol, and some fat-soluble drugs. So digestion itself does not happen in your stomach. It absorbs very little. Alcohol being one, which is why it is important, or it is better for you to have food in your stomach when you drink alcohol, because if you don't have food in your stomach, that alcohol is instantly absorbed into the stomach lining. If you have food, there's more in your stomach, so it's not going to have quite as much of an effect. But your stomach mixes, it secretes juices, it does not absorb much. Most of that is going to happen in your small intestine. So the stomach's job is to mix, moisten, add some enzymes, but it's not actually digesting. It's more of a storage area. So when you do eat a meal, mixing actions of the stomach turn the food into chyme. So a bolus is the small part of food that enters your esophagus, comes into your stomach. Once that food enters your stomach, it gets mixed with the gastric juices, the hydrochloric acid, and then it becomes chyme, and that chyme is going to go towards the pyloric region and into your intestine. And there's another, if you've had the flu for a long period of time, and you've thrown up a lot, and you actually start throwing up something that's kind of a greenish color and has a horrible, horrible taste, that is chyme. Chyme has kind of a greenish color, very acidic, and if you no longer have food in your stomach, that is what will come up if you throw up. The rate that the food is emptied or the stomach is emptied depends on how fluid that chyme is and the type of food. So here, fats take the longest to digest, which is why fats are a good source of energy because they stick with you for a long period of time. Proteins and carbohydrates are going to pass through much more quickly than fats will, which is also why carbohydrates are broken down very quickly. As chyme leaves the stomach, it's going to fill the duodenum, which is part of your small intestine. Accessory organs, pancreas, liver, and gallbladder, are going to add their secretions when food enters the small intestine. So that's when all the accessory organs add what they have to your food. And that is where we'll totally stop for today.